Hello, friends. I'm coming to you from my classroom this Sunday evening, and I wanted to spend a little bit of time with you on this glorious song/poem from the end of George MacDonald's novel Warlock or Glenwarlock, first published in the United States in 1881. I just recently finished reading this novel for the first time. I've read many other of George MacDonald's novels, but this was my first reading of this one. And I was completely taken with this poem, which I think beautifully sums up not only his message in this particular story, but also the message of his life, the message that he seeks to convey in all of his writings. And while I can't say I understand all the thoughts in this poem perfectly yet, I'd like to go through with you verse by verse and just dwell on them. I was inspired to try my hand at writing a melody for this poem, and so I think I'm going to sing it first, and then we'll go through verse by verse. And what I tried to do with this melody is just to try to capture a tiny bit of the radiant triumph which you see in the poem, and that's why it really hovers around the tonic in the upper octave. So here is my attempt to set it to a melody. All things are shadows of the Lord. Whoops. I have a pretty low voice, and if I start it that high, it's not going to work. So let me try that again. All things are shadows of the Lord. The sun himself is but a shade. My soul is but the shadow of thy word, a candle sun-bedayed. Diamonds are shadows of the sun. They drink his rays and show a spark. My soul some gleam of thy great shine hath won, and round me slays the dark. All knowledge is but broken shades, in gulfs of dark a wandering horde. Together rush the parted glory grades, and lo, thy garment, Lord. My soul, the shadow still is light, because the shadow falls from thee. I turned, O candle, to the center bright, and home flit shadowy. Shine, shine, make me thy shadow still, the brighter still, the more thy shade. My motion be thy lovely moveless will, my darkness light delayed. Now let's try going through, starting from verse 1. First, this hymn remarkably keeps a consistent image throughout of shadows cast by the light, and shadows cast by such a strong light that he envisions that the shadows themselves are lights. The image of shadows was a very important one to MacDonald and occurs throughout his writings. I think of his short story, The Shadows, which appeared in Adela Cathcart in 1864 as an example. And here that image of shadows is very consistently carried out, I think, through the song. This song also really reminds me of his later sermon, The Mirrors of the Lord, written a few years later and published in Series 3 of his unspoken sermons. And I think it's worth reading it alongside of that sermon. One of the things that I love about this poem is its wonderfully affirmative vision of human selfhood. seeing ourselves as directly derivative from God's great self and presently and continuously sustained by his great creative self. And so even our shadow selves, even ourselves as not really having light in themselves, are still light because they're being cast from the great light. You could say that this is a rather pantheistic poem, and MacDonald was sometimes accused during his life, and I suppose he has been since, of pantheism. And now I think we have the better word, panentheism, which much more accurately expresses his thought of God dwelling in and being the life of all things, and yet his being related but distinct from his creation. And I think that's a better way to look at this. But I think it's worth appreciating the intimate tie that MacDonald understands between the giver of being and given being, and therefore between himself and us. MacDonald says, what else can be so close as making and made? Not twinned can be more near. Thou art more nigh to me than is this thinking I, than that I mean when I by me is said. That's a quotation from one of the short 7-line poems in his Diary of an Old Soul, or his Book of Strife in the form of the Diary of an Old Soul, which was also published at this same time as Warlock of Glenwarlock. Now, Warlock of Glenwarlock is centered on diamonds. Diamonds are central to the story, and MacDonald's own love of precious stones, which was attested to by his son Greville in Greville's biography of his parents, comes out very much in this story. And in this story, at a crucial moment, the protagonist, Cosmo, discovers a treasure hoard of diamonds and precious stones, and it's the turn of his own fortunes. And yeah, a little bit in the story, it's a deus ex machina which rescues him from poverty and enables him to marry the girl that he's supposed to marry. And so in that sense, it might seem to be not the most original plot device, yet it's really rescued by the consistency of Cosmo's character and the character of his father, which is developed through the story, I think. And so the discovery of the treasure, while it's a little conventional, a little bit of a kind of a rescue to the plot, which you can see has been plotted from the beginning of the story, is, I think, greatly redeemed by the symbolism of the story and by what I think is the consistent development of Cosmo's character. Now, Cosmo and his father may be examples of what some people feel are the too good to be true characters in some of MacDonald's stories, but MacDonald himself knew people like this, and he himself became a person like this, I think. And so I think in MacDonald's hands, these characters are realistic, and I think it takes the faith and imagination to really understand the inner lives of these characters, to believe that they are realistic in the highest sense. And I think once you're fully immersed in the becoming, in the development of that kind of faith in your own being, I think it does become more and more realistic to think someone could live with that kind of trust in the Father as to be materially unaffected by fortune or the loss or gain of it. At any rate, I think that this poem can be read very profitably, even without having read the story, the novel at all. And I'd like to jump before we even really go back into the image of the diamonds. I'd like to jump to verse 3 briefly, where he talks about knowledge as a bunch of facets, right? Like broken shards, individual, all these pieces of knowledge, right, which by themselves don't really give us anything. They are these broken shards or facets, which, when they come together in harmony, when together rush the parted glory grades. That word grade there is interesting, and I'm not sure. I think we should see that as grades as in steps, like steps on a staircase, and then maybe like facets, stepping facets, almost kind of fusing the image of the gem and the staircase. But when they come together, when these pieces of knowledge are harmoniously viewed in their relation to their source, then all knowledge becomes the living garment in which the Lord is living and moving, right? And for the full appreciation of this verse, you really have to read his sermon, The Truth, in the Unspoken Sermons, and how he views knowledge and how he views truth. Because MacDonald sees all reality as meant by the living thought of the Lord, and therefore everything reflecting and revealing his thought. And in a beautiful passage in that sermon, Truth, he envisions light itself as the garment, and he thinks about the laws of electromagnetism and the laws of light, and he says, the scientifically discovered laws of light seem to me a beautiful reflection of who God is. And he says, but what if light is the living garment of the Lord, that its waves, its waving is the waving of his garment, because he's living and walking in it. And such a beautiful fusion of the imagination with science. Sometimes MacDonald is understood to be depreciating science, but MacDonald loved science. What he didn't love was reductionist science. He loved poetic science. He loved the ability to reflect on discovered properties and bring those fragments of knowledge into a big picture where we see the fitness and the meaning that God could be meaning through it. And I think this is borne out by subsequent scientific discovery and the seeming spooky, almost personality-infused quality of light in its discovered laws. This fourth verse, my soul, the shadow still is light, because the shadow falls from thee. I turn dull candle to the center bright, and home flit shadowy. Maybe my favorite. So often we get taken up and kind of overwhelmed by the shadowy aspect of ourselves and our shadow selves. And sometimes we feel that in ourselves there's more darkness than light. And that could be a source of great despair in the Kierkegaardian sense. And I love how MacDonald here turns that on its head and encourages us to see ourselves as presently generated by the living light. That, and I love C.S. Lewis, and this is going to seem like an aside, but it's not. I love C.S. Lewis. One thing I don't love is the image that he uses in Beyond Personality. I believe that's the essay that's part of Mere Christianity. It's been a long time since I've read it, where he uses the image of toy soldiers that God is bringing to life. And it's, despite his acknowledgement of MacDonald as his master, I think that's really one place where he really hadn't yet absorbed the best of MacDonald's teaching. Because MacDonald does not see us as toy soldiers. He does not see us as things which God shapes and then sets down in his toy model world. Whoops, sorry about that. And then sets us going and lets us run around in this toy model world of his, and then becomes a character in the toy world and tries to get us to become real and flesh instead of clay or metal. And that's so alien to MacDonald's thought. MacDonald sees us as words that were not just spoken once and spun off into the distance, but as words of God's that he is speaking right now, and that live and move and have our being right now because he is speaking us. And that, yes, God has separated us far enough from himself at the cost of great pain to himself, like the labor pangs of a mother. Separated us far enough from himself that we can have the existence of an individual and turn and look up to him and cry out to him and reach up to him. But he's not separated us from himself so far that the umbilical cord has been severed. We live and move, directly connected to the giver of our being, who is still and always the giver of our being. And I think that's the beautiful thing in MacDonald's thought. And so he encourages us to see our being as a light from the Father of Lights, as he says, the Father of Lights, as the mentally disabled character who reveals God. He has a lot of those characters in his novels, as it's been rightly pointed out. Says in Malcolm, Father of Lights, and therefore Father of us, and therefore we are lights that come from him. And we turn back to our center. Not to be reabsorbed, but to be fulfilled, to know that we're fulfilled. And then this last verse here, shine, shine, make me thy shadow still. The brighter still, the more thy shade. My motion be thy lovely moveless will, my darkness light delayed. This is a verse which I'm still dwelling on, and I'm not sure if I entirely love the idea of the moveless will. I think in one of MacDonald's sermons, The Word of Jesus on Prayer, he rightly points out that seeing God as the unmoved mover would be a naive philosophical mistake, that he calls it a stupidity of perfection, where God can't move and adapt himself to change in the creation. And he sees that one of the glorious freedoms of God's being is his ability to change his plans because of the freedom of his creatures. Not that makes him less, and to see that doesn't make him less, but it actually makes him greater, that he is capable of making room for free beings and yet accomplishing his greater purpose despite obstacles. And I think that's right. And so I'm not sure about that phrase, the moveless will, unless maybe you think about it as the moveless central will, determination to bring all things to fulfillment in his own joy and glory. And then that is lovely, because he's not going to be deterred from that by anything. And then we do have this kind of lovely contrast between my motion within that stable center of God's unchanging determination to redeem all things. And then the other phrase that I'm really still dwelling on here is, my darkness light delayed. Let's think about that. What does that mean? My darkness light delayed. I think we can get an intuitive sense of it, that what we still see in ourselves, we still are tempted to focus on, crying out, God, I don't have anything in of myself. I don't have what I need to survive this day, to live through this day. I don't see any light in myself, just darkness. We're tempted to focus on that, focus on what feels like our lack, rather than just being the moon to God's sun and being the mirror of the Lord, and just allowing what appears to be our darkness to simply be the dawn. Because the Holy Ghost broods over the bent world with warm breath and with bright wings, as Gerard Manley Hopkins says. And then that makes sense to me. Before we close, I'd just like to briefly go back to the beginning of the poem. And there is a place, and I believe that it is in his sermon from the first series of unspoken sermons, The New Name, where he sees us all as diamonds cut from the great diamond. And it may be also from one of his later sermons on the resurrection, the inheritance. And it certainly, I think, owes something to his indebtedness to Dante, in the Paradiso especially. But I'm no expert there. But I think that overall, this hymn, with its consistent image of my soul is but the shadow of thy word. The sun himself is but a shade, an expression of the light. But so am I, a light shadow, directly and outspeaking of his own word. A candle sun-bedayed. And when I read that first verse, it took me a while to realize what bedayed meant. I thought it was some, kind of rare Anglo-Saxon archaic term. And then I realized it's just from day. So bedayed would be caught by the day, overwhelmed by the day. In some of my favorite poems from Rabindranath Tagore in his collection Gitanjali, he expresses this image of the soul as a candle that is now the sun has arisen, and it seems like the candle's day is over, but it's just dying into the greater day. And this reminds me of his story Photogen and Nycteris, and how Nycteris says, what if when we go out, it's but to go out into that greater light? And that is what I think he's saying here. And again, not an absorption into non-personality, which is not what mystics, even Indian mystics like Rabindranath Tagore and Kavya are saying either. But this longed-for union with a light that is the source of our light. So let's have the courage to see ourselves as light and not darkness. Derivative light, but no less light. Even our shadow selves are his light delayed. So let's just turn and be mirrors. I hope that this poem was an encouragement to you. And I'm just going to close with singing this one more time, and maybe you can sing it with me. All things are shadows of the Lord. The sun himself is but a shade. My soul is but the shadow of thy word, a candle sun-bedayed. Diamonds are shadows of the sun. They drink his rays and show a spark. My soul some gleam of thy great shine hath won, and round me slays the dark. All knowledge is but broken shades, in gulfs of dark a wandering horde. Together rush the parted glory grades, and lo, thy garment, Lord. My soul the shadow still is light, because the shadow falls from thee. I turn, dull candle, to the center bright, and home flit shadowy. Shine, shine, make me thy shadow still, the brighter still the more thy shade. My motion be thy lovely moveless will, my darkness light delayed. May some of that triumph rub off on your soul this week. Amen.